we have an immediate issue.
In the next 3 years?
Yes.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has issued a clear warning.
If you slow China down, the world slows down.
Such times are very much like the 1930s. We have a breaking down of the monetary order.
What's up, guys? It's Graham here, and it's official. China's entire housing market has just completely collapsed. Without exaggeration, the last 20 years of gains have now been fully wiped out in the blink of an eye. That's an estimated $18 trillion gone from the one asset that was never supposed to fall. Even worse, but China's housing collapse isn't slowing down. Prices have fallen now for 35 months in a row, and it's becoming so bad that people are beginning to wonder if the world's second largest economy could lose 20 years of housing growth, seemingly overnight. Yet the same thing also happened here in the United States. Because let's be real, by the time everyone agrees that there's a problem, it's usually too late to do anything about it. That's why we gotta talk about exactly what's going on, what this means for your own money here in the United States, and then most importantly, whether or not there's a risk to our own housing market doing something similar. Because I gotta say, the more I looked into this, the more it feels as though this is something that's about to spill over into the rest of the world. Although before we start, as usual, if you appreciate all the research that goes into a video like this, it would mean the world to me if you hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done that already. It just helps out the channel. It's dumb, I get it, but as a thank you for doing that, here's a picture of a catfish. So thanks so much, and also big thank you to SoFi for sponsoring this video, but more on that later. All right, so in order to understand exactly how crazy this housing collapse is, it's important to realize that in China, a house is not just a house. Instead, it's what I would like to call the wealth trap. See, for those unfamiliar, up until the late 1990s, most of the housing in China was provided by the government. But as the country started expanding, they realized that housing would need to be privatized as a way to incentivize developers to build faster, banks to lend more, and families to start buying homes of their own to generate extra economic activity. But as soon as that happened, everything changed. All of a sudden, hundreds of millions of people moved from farms to cities. Incomes were rising, debt was cheap, and urban homeownership exploded from about 50% in 1996 to roughly 90%. But here's the part that most people miss. The average Chinese family had very few spots to put their money. Like, the stock market was volatile and it wasn't trusted. Bank deposits paid barely anything, and strict capital control meant that you couldn't quite freely move your money. So real estate became the default investment for the vast majority of Chinese citizens. Again, this was not an investment, it was the investment. It was your safety net, your social status, your college fund. It was everything wrapped up in a single apartment. In fact, by the peak, 70% of Chinese household wealth was tied up in housing, which for context is twice as concentrated as here in the United States, and 22% of urban households owned multiple homes, which, yeah, is a lot. Now, at first that created a feedback loop, which worked exactly as they had hoped. Families bought homes, developers borrowed money to build more homes, local governments sold them the land, which made up about 40% of the revenue, banks kept lending, prices kept rising, and as a result, households bought even more. To give you an idea of just how extensive this was, at the very peak, real estate and everything connected to it made up roughly a quarter of China's entire economy, and prices increased nearly 700% from 2001 to 2017. It even got so extreme that buyers would pay up to 23 times their annual salary just to buy a house. Several cities used lottery systems to allocate them, and developers pre-sold apartments that didn't even exist yet, with buyers making mortgage payments on nothing other than a rendering and a promise, because prices just only kept going up higher, right? Well, as it turns out, that was exactly when everything broke. And in terms of what actually popped the bubble, we gotta talk about what I would like to call the housing reset. See, by 2020, even the Chinese government could tell that things were getting out of hand. Prices were skyrocketing, homes were sitting empty, smaller cities were wildly overbuilt, and developers were carrying an insane amount of debt. So Beijing stepped in with a policy called the Three Red Lines, which is just a fancy way of saying that the money printer for developers was essentially just shut off overnight. And the moment that happened, everything started to collapse. First, developers like Evergrande, who had borrowed $300 billion, suddenly couldn't roll over their debt. Eventually, they were forced into a liquidation, with Country Garden, who's one of the largest home builders in the country, defaulting on its dollar bonds very shortly afterwards. This sent shockwaves throughout the entire housing market, because when the two giants failed, smaller developers all of a sudden couldn't finish the millions of apartments that were already pre-sold, which meant that regular families were now paying mortgages on properties that didn't even exist and may not ever exist because the developer was out of business. In fact, in 2022, this got so bad that buyers across hundreds of stalled projects threatened to just stop paying their mortgages entirely. That, of course, leads to the final domino beginning to fall, which would be confidence. Because when one person sees their neighbor paying into a mortgage on a property that doesn't even exist yet, they stop buying. And when they stop buying, developers lose their pre-sale money needed to finish the construction, which stalls projects even more, which scares away even more buyers. Basically, the same feedback loop that caused prices to rise for 20 years is now working in reverse, and there's nothing anyone could do to stop it. On top of that, Add in an aging population, fewer marriages, slowing urbanization, and an estimated inventory overhang in the tens of millions of empty or unfinished housing units, and you have the perfect storm that's leading to the biggest housing crash ever in history, purely because China's just so massive. So in terms of what's happening